What if the greatest force behind global exploration wasn't courage, curiosity, or even kings, but an institution most people never imagine as an investor? An institution that never sailed a ship, never mined gold, yet quietly shaped the entire economic system of empire. The age of exploration wasn't powered by adventure, it was powered by legitimacy, risk management, and financial logic. And at the center of it all stood the Catholic Church, transforming uncertainty into opportunity. Understanding this hidden funding model changes everything we think we know about how the modern world was built. The most influential financial supporter of the age of exploration was not a fearless navigator, an ambitious monarch, or a brilliant trader, but an institution rarely considered an investor at all, one that never constructed ships, never crossed oceans, and never personally gathered treasure, yet quietly determined the economic framework of global expansion and reshaped the course of history. The Catholic Church, without which the modern world would have developed in an entirely different way. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where wealth, authority, and history intersect, and where simple stories are almost always misleading. When people picture the age of exploration, they usually imagine a romantic scene of courageous men gazing toward unknown horizons, ships disappearing into distant seas, and heroic flags planted on foreign shores. But what is almost never shown is the financial reality behind those images. Because exploration was not primarily a tale of curiosity, it was a story of investment decisions made under extreme uncertainty. In the late 15th century, Europe was exhausted by centuries of conflict, disease, and political rivalry. Populations had been devastated by the Black Death. Royal treasuries were chronically empty, taxation systems were primitive, and credit markets were fragile. While long-distance voyages required years of preparation, enormous expense, and offered no guarantee of return, with ships frequently lost, crews dying, and entire expeditions failing quietly at great cost. From a purely economic standpoint, overseas exploration appeared irrational. Extremely high risk, long delays before any payoff, and almost no reliable information, and although private merchants could afford to sponsor an occasional voyage and kings could fund symbolic attempts, sustained global expansion demanded something far more durable, an institution capable of thinking in generations rather than months, one that could absorb failure without collapsing, and one that could transform violent conquest into recognized legality and uncertainty into destiny. That institution already existed. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was not only a religious authority but also the largest landholder in Europe, the most stable international organization on earth, a bureaucracy that survived kings, wars, and dynasties, controlling courts, universities, legal doctrine, and moral legitimacy itself, functioning in modern terms as a kind of permanent supranational sovereign with an enduring balance sheet, and most importantly possessing something no monarch or merchant could create on their own: the power to define what was considered lawful. This is where the familiar story of brave explorers becomes a story of economics, because the Church did not finance voyages by handing out money or loading ships with treasure, but in a far more significant way. It reduced risk, granted legitimacy, and issued something more valuable than gold: permission. In a world with no international law, no global courts, and no shared understanding of property beyond Europe, papal authority operated as a kind of legal operating system, turning conquest into administration, seizure into ownership, and violence into accepted governance. This is why papal decrees mattered more than canons. For when the Church declared a claim legitimate, it became politically and legally recognized, creating enforceable property rights over lands no European had ever seen, and the most striking example came in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal using a single imaginary line drawn across the Atlantic, with no surveys, no consultation with local populations, and no evidence, only authority. From a financial perspective, this was revolutionary because it effectively eliminated legitimacy risk, the danger that any gains from exploration would later be challenged or rejected, and as a result investors no longer needed to fear that their conquests would be declared illegal, since they were pre-approved, dramatically lowering the cost of capital and transforming exploration from reckless gambling into sanctioned expansion. Only Spain and Portugal were positioned to exploit this system immediately, becoming the operational arms of a sacred investment model in which the Church provided the legal and moral framework while the Crown supplied ships, soldiers, and administrators, together constructing the first truly global extraction economy. Early expeditions were not especially expensive by royal standards. Columbus's first voyage cost roughly 2 million maravedis, a manageable sum, and what made them transformative was not the initial investment but the enormous scale of returns once extraction began. As by the mid-16th century, Spanish silver shipments from the Americas reached hundreds of tons annually, reshaping European monetary systems, triggering inflation, and creating and destroying fortunes, all under an institutional structure that claimed its share not through trade but through authorization. The Church did not take profits like a modern shareholder, nor demand dividends. Instead, it demanded structure. Land grants for religious orders, mandatory tithes, exclusive rights to conversion, and permanent roles within colonial administration, forms of power that expanded without requiring further investment. This aspect is often overlooked, for the church was not seeking short-term gain but rather converting economic growth into lasting institutional authority, securing vast land holdings, legal courts, control over education and morality, and influence over marriage, inheritance, and labor norms, ensuring that every voyage launched under a blessed flag expanded not only trade routes but jurisdiction itself. Gold and silver accelerated the system, but they were never the ultimate objective. The true prize was a renewable foundation of obedience, taxation, and cultural control that reproduced itself across generations, forming a cycle in which conquest justified conversion, conversion legitimized governance, governance enabled extraction, and extraction funded further conquest, a loop that required no direct management because the church controlled the narrative that made it appear righteous and inevitable. Nothing multiplies power more effectively than controlling the story people tell themselves about why domination and seizure are necessary, and this was the real funding model of the age of exploration. Not bravery or belief, but legitimacy engineered at scale by an institution that understood long before modern finance that the most valuable asset in any risky venture is the right to claim the results as lawful. When this system finally began to fracture, it did so loudly through rebellions, confiscations, pamphlets, and wars that stretched across generations, and what collapsed was not faith itself but the authority that had made the model function. The break arrived in the early 16th century when large parts of Northern Europe rejected papal supremacy, and what history remembers as theological debate was in practice an institutional revolt, as princes and merchants stopped recognizing Rome as the ultimate source of legal legitimacy, making papal decrees powerless outside Catholic territories and stripping them of their ability to reduce risk. Figures like Martin Luther were therefore not only challenging religious practices but attacking the legal backbone of European order. And once rulers could claim sovereignty without papal approval, the old exploration model rapidly weakened. For Catholic powers, expansion had relied on a sacred operating system, but for emerging Protestant states that system meant nothing, and England, the Dutch Republic, and others ignored papal boundaries entirely, treating them as irrelevant opinions rather than binding law. Exploration did not end. Instead, it became privatized, and once religious legitimacy no longer functioned as universal insurance, risk shifted from the church to the marketplace, from theology to contracts, and from divine mandate to shareholder return. This change explains why later global expansion was driven not by missionaries and royal fleets, but by chartered corporations and joint stock companies, with the Dutch East India Company founded in 1602 as the clearest example. An organization that could wage war, sign treaties, mint currency, and govern territory without invoking religious authority, deriving legitimacy from capital and legal innovation rather than faith. The English followed a similar path, treating colonies in North America as demographic and property experiments instead of holy missions, where land ownership and settlement, not immediate plunder, became the strategy for profit. This also explains why North America developed later and differently than Latin America. There were no centralized empires or silver mountains to seize, and without a church-backed extraction mandate, colonies had to become self-sustaining, producing societies based more on contracts and property than on centralized authority. Neither system was moral, but they generated wealth in different ways and on different timelines, and by the late 17th century the age of exploration quietly ended, not because the world was fully known, but because the question had changed from discovery to integration. What followed was an era of optimization rather than exploration, in which corporate empires replaced sacred ones and legitimacy came from law, markets, and force instead of religion. The same underlying logic remained. Authority reduces risk, lower risk attracts capital, and capital reshapes the world. And this pattern continues into the modern financial system where institutions still profit by authorizing risks they do not personally bear, and moral narratives still soften the violence of expansion. The tools have evolved, but the structure endures, and the final lesson is uncomfortable yet precise. The age of exploration was not funded by courage or curiosity, but by institutions that mastered the conversion of legitimacy into leverage. When religion controlled legitimacy, it financed empire, and when religion lost that control, capital took its place. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.